I didn't know they were here. So to start, I'd like to invite you to take a few breaths with me. So close your eyes. And we're going to breathe in through our noses and breathe out through our mouths. So we're going to take 3 breaths. In and out. In and out. In and out. Continue to breathe like this for a few moments and answer this question for me. Is the sky above or below the northern of thought? They used to tell me always to pray, so when I die, I can go to heaven. I looked up at the cloudy sky and she told me, that's where it is. She was liberated from the binds of her body on a clear sunny day, and I asked her, why can't I see you if you are up there? She replied, well, heaven is further above. This is a painful declaration of independence.
What the hell do they mean when they say independence? Those who institute dependence, those who impose colonial rule, those who enforce the strategy of winning hearts and minds, those who implement the divide and rule policy, those who wage wars to defend their economic interests, those who exploit bodies and souls to grow, those who use blackmails to achieve political military goals, those who interfere with internal affairs, those who control external natural and human resources, those who violate signed treaties and laws, those who take and take and take, but also those who are and were subjected to colonial rule every day. Those who face hate speeches, cases, protocols and behaviors every day. Those who are confronted with white supremacy every day. Independence? It is, or it should be, an exemption from reliance on an external power. It is, or it should be, a non-subjugation to another's authority. It is, or it should be, a freedom from outside control and law. It is, or it should be, a direction of one's own affairs without interference. It is a preservation of the divide and rule policy. It is the continuation of a colonial presence by other means. It is the reinforcement of colonial legacies. It is the extension of a different kind of power. It is the facilitation of internal and external conflicts and wars. It is the intervention in the exploitation of natural and human resources. It is the development of a contiguity relationship. It is the design and enforcement of a perpetual intimate distance. But also, it is the establishment of deep interdependences. No, my dear, my friend. No, my dear, my enemy. I do not subscribe to this cosmetic language. I do not want to wear this mask. I do not support this camouflage. I'm not gone, I'm here, and we need to face this together.
With me tonight doing this presentation are the spirits and words of my sister siblings, Paula, Pino, Martins, Nassif, Samia Henny, Faluke Taylor, Marwa Belghazi, and Selena Rose, and also the spirits of many others who have declared or are in a process of declaring with me. And if you concentrate hard enough, you will see them standing here with me. I also bring along with me a line of ancestors who survived through many different moments of being unseen, unheard, unsupported, and unnoticed. They dreamed me into being. This is a painful declaration of independence. Amma wrote for herself a poem, a declaration of independence. Oh, my dear brother, the decision to sever and to separate was not based on the knowledge of me as a forever dreamer, unable and incapable of handling the clear world of take and take and take. This is another declaration of independence for the women who contribute to me, inspire me, keep me alive. My mothers, my lovers, sisters, cousins, daughters, comrades, conspirators. This is for the ones who have left us, for Andrea Levy, for Ntozake Shange, for Alana Lockwood, for BC Silva, for Toni Morrison, keepers and disseminators of our stories and our images, now ancestors. And for my grandmother, Abba Dinah Kwansama Edwin Bading, who died at 102 years old, singing praises to the Lord. And for my friend and sister, Khadija Say, and her mother, Mary Mendy. I walked barefoot at the opening of the Diaspora Pavilion with a basket full of candles with these words from Angela Yvonne Davis handwritten on them. Freedom is a constant struggle. The palazzo filled with those privileged to make it to the opening of the opening week of the Venice Biennale, and our sisters and my artists, fellow artists, and Khadija. We declared independence not as a nation. We declared autonomy over our bodies, our words, our histories, herstories, our traces elevated into objects of ritual remembering, an archaeology of Black memory. San, ko, fa. I speak in the tongues of my mother and my grandmothers before her. Although I do not know the words, my very being is evidence of those languages. It is in these languages that I speak. It is in these words that I will create. It is in these words that I question. I question this place, the diaspora place, as an ideal or narrative of my relationship to my internal migratory roots. As the distance between becomes more apparent as we get to second, third, and fourth generations removed from motherlands, how do I map myself in this place? My family, the people that arrived and that continue to arrive and that have left, even though they make borders and checkpoints and build walls, the process of making is enacting a presence, the hard navigation of presences, absences, visibility, invisibility, navigating, finding roots, arranging traces from memories of archives that will never be constituted, entering spaces without invitation, or spaces that have an antagonistic or conditional invitations, time-limited invitations, invitation by special arrangement. A presence is a performance of a certain kind of sociability that explains a connection, but always keeps you outside, always arriving, never settled. The need becomes urgent. Utterances, sounds become words, whispers, shouts. The need to collect, assemble, activate the stories, the narratives, undo the knowledges, the what is known, to make something visible. Love and rage exist within me simultaneously. I wrote this for the Feminist Emergencies Conference at BAK, University of London, and have continued to develop it and rewrite it. Approximately 5 weeks after the Diaspora Pavilion opened, billed as by the Financial Times as Britain's other pavilion, with the party that ended all parties, the party that everyone wanted to be at. Approximately 5 weeks after that opening day, that opening, that party, that arrival, my colleagues, collaborators, my friends and I were in mourning as we watched a burning tower, knowing that our friend and sister, Khadija, sent us messages of distress, knowing that there was nothing we could do. So what does it mean to arrive somewhere? To be every day discovered?
This is...
There's a video that's not playing. Is it that one?
This is...
Yeah. Got it.
This is our Declaration of Independence. This is our circle. Our circle draws on the West African traditions of Momome. Momome is cleansing. Momome is a cleansing of the community. A ritual to re-establish the social, cultural, and political order. A communal and societal purification. Momome is for us. Momome is for women. We do this for us, to protect and purify ourselves. We evoke Momome as a symbolic shield against outside dangers that threaten us. In Momome, we witness each other, care for each other, speak to each other, protect each other, defend each other. We also draw on the long-time traditions of our indigenous cultures and our activist and healing communities. For us, the circle provides space for fresh possibilities, connections, collaborations, and understanding. Our circle will hold the tensions and emotions that will contribute to our transformation and support us to use our collective energy to take action. This is our process. It is not about changing others, but rather an invitation for us to change our relationship to ourselves, our communities, and the wider world. Calling Delegate Rosanna Raymond.
Homuri ho e ho, pupuhi ki a ho, meri ta kuhuti nahana whakamari e tahaku wahirua no te riri oro raru mahara he. Ka haere heo ki te mahunga, a piki ake, kaki ake te mahunga. Mikumi ki te mate puhuna, e rite tono ki te whakataua ki. Humbia ki ngā maunga kia puri a koe. He ngā hoa tawhiri mate au. He ho mahi mau mahara, he re re ronga he raharo, tahai o fi o wangi, hui a ta kuhuti nana, whakahora taku kaha, whakapaenge horuia, whakawate te huarahi ki te pono me te tika ki te ao marama e.
It is more than inclusions. So perhaps what I want to add to this conversation, to propose to this instituting otherwise moment as we think about the proposition of art at a moment of immense uncertainty. But have we ever been certain? To think about what it means to practice, but not being seduced by the current trends of diversity or of art as art as a political tool for change or another future, but to think in this moment, what does it mean to once again be discovered, but this time being allowed in? What does it mean to practice and stand in a position of being anti-empire, to contemplate the possibility of liberation, and in this consciousness that we may be coming to very close to the end of the world? And in that consciousness, asking questions such as those that Adrian and Autumn Brown propose in their How to Survive the End of the World podcast. What are you willing to give up? And like Alexis Pauline Gums and Jackie Alexander and other Black feminists from many diasporas, drawing on the memories and strength of our foremothers, and to know that we are here to continue that work, that our ancestors dreamed us up, and that we're in the process of becoming ancestors. I remember that we live in a time that Saadia Hartman called the afterlife of slavery. Could also be described, thank you Laura for bringing her into the room, as the wake of slavery, colonization and modernity. Its impacts affecting us daily: neoliberalism, global capital, fascism, racism, war, refugeeism, migration, poverty, climate crisis. Thank you, Christina Sharp. To think from a place that my friend and collaborator, Dr. Karen Salt, the director of the Center for Race and Rights, once posed: what is it to do criticality and remain whole in unjust space? What if we never arrive? What if that becoming never becomes? What is the seduction in arriving and becoming? Performing presence, becoming, remaining absent. Can we perform a sense of being present? Representation, visibility, being visible. No amount of doing will make you present, us present, me present. No process of presence can really see you, us, me. No possibility of having really really having an equitable presence? How do we make sure that we are really whole at the end of this? Yesterday, I was introduced to a life process for climate tragedy, a form of personal and collective adaptation, which prompted a 4 R's approach to preparation for the end of the world. Resilient. But myself and my communities are already supposed to be resilient. Relinquishment. But my ancestors, and now myself and my communities, have already relinquished so much. Restoration. So I read a dictionary definition that said the act of restoring, renewal, revival, or establishment, the state of something being restored, a return of something to former, original, normal, or unimpaired condition. Restitution of something taken away or lost. What can restoration do for me, my communities, and my ancestors? The final R is reconciliation. What will be reconciled? Is it enough that you read Catherine Yusuf, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None? Is it okay that you decolonize everything or quote Black feminist theory or queer theory? What will reconcile this? Making us, me, visible is not solving this riddle, especially when after you see me, you cannot hear me. And if we take up this visibility position, is this healing ourselves, or is it doing more damage to us? Technologies of surveillance were invented so that we could be seen. My friend Karen proposes that we think about being in twilight, as Derek Walcott describes it in his book of essays, What Twilight Says. Thinking about the Caribbean as a dreamlike paradise tainted with the horror of a violent history. She asks us to think about the toxic soils in which we exist. These soils not just being actual soil, but maybe if we consider actual soil, that not only carries the taste of chemicals, pollution, and hard metals, but also the taste of spilled blood. These soils are also the spaces and places we inhabit, we walk in, we breathe in, we attempt to be in. We are in a constant state of rehearsal, perhaps of practicing, being in a place of practicing as a state of being in a constant state of practicing, processes. I try to contend with this all by collaborating, holding these ideas and refusing the center, but also not holding the peripheries. With the mind of decolonial praxis, liberatory praxis, critical praxis, conspiratory praxis, breathing with, planning with, sharing with, fighting with, daring with, loving with, my sisters, my siblings, telling our stories, taking up space, attempting to find a wholeness in this oh so unjust world.
Unless my ancestors tell me to whisper, to hold these words in my mouth, I shall not. I make space to listen. I hear clearer now the words they send. I feel them running through me, insistent, eager to do their work. Words to break silence with, words to play with, words to pray with, word smoke incense curling from my lips, my own burnt offerings, soft as water, sharp as coral, sweeter than lipstick. If silence is an unequal share of the cake and no space to breathe and the awkward shapes of making comfortable and being polite or turning away or outside in, and if silence is no permission to weep or wail or roar and say things that need to be said, interrupt it. Walk right in and mess it up. And if the comfort is false, a privileged pretense, something hoarded in high places or behind locked gates and peddled in print and film as fodder for lazy, cliched endings that render you invisible? Disrupt it. I beg you. I beg me. I beg us. Burning quietly is not dignity. So,
more fire!
I am a bridge, connecting people to each other, carrying words back and forth, juggling with languages, with spaces, in perpetual movements, sitting in circles, in triangles, letting words transform in my body, making sense. Those people, their names, their faces, what do we do with all of these stories? Where do they go? They don't just disappear. Sometimes they linger in my head, haunt me. What do I do with all of that? What space do I keep for them in my memory? If you live in the same world I live in, then the words, the names, the stories slowly fade away, replaced by new ones. And then Muhammad could have been Ahmed. Soraya could have been Maryam. Namisata could have been Malian or Senegalese. Where names are forgotten, stories erased, we sum up all these souls in a number. They become a newspaper article, a title. 500 drowned in the Mediterranean. Say her name, say his name, say their names.
Say her name, say his name, say their name. We are here to provide a stimulus for a conversation with you as an audience about the perceptions of the subject's identity, the subject being women of colour, and how our identities are determined by the environment we live in. Our identity is shaped by the way others perceive us that make them feel comfortable, from what we wear to our natural hair, to our ways of living just to survive, are constantly questioned, ridiculed, and frowned upon. And in time, we conform to this sterilized way of being just to fit in and be heard, but still our words are diluted. My lack of attachment to the colour black stemming from my childhood regarding my British Caribbean identity, made to feel outcasted, made to believe that I had limited choices in life by those who are afraid of our potential. Afraid of what we bring to the table, because it makes them reconsider what they're bringing. Re-exploring the path and journeys that we created for ourselves, pausing to consider the voices that played a part in us holding back. Crossing boundaries back into territory that has been made unfamiliar to us. How do we retain our identity when finding ourselves out of shape, redesigned, trying to find ways to communicate to those who are afraid of what they don't understand? We are not the enemy. We are nothing but distant travelling companions, shedding our skin, growing at different paces and levels. Beneath the skin, there is a battered body, wounds to bear, covered by makeup, excuses, and lies. Parts of our identity that has been lost, hidden, and denied. We now leave our wounds bare to show that we are not afraid. We are now reclaiming our identity and feeling whole again. So how do we take our place center stage?
Leave your face at the door. Turn off your swag and check your bag. From your lips to your Timbs, get down. But whatever you do, hey, don't fuck with my groove. Whatever you do, 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 don't
Someone's Shazammed it. But whatever you do, don't funk with my groove. Declaring, making declarations, declaring our interdependence. Can you take one last breath with me? In for all those who can't breathe, and out for all the times you have lost your breath. And to end, I want to thank again the sisters who are with me today, presented the ones that voiced themselves, that is Paola, Samia, Faluke, and Rosanna, and all the women who have declared with me in various different places. Freedom is a constant struggle. Thank you.
God, and I'm going to knock something over. It's like everybody, it's been fine thus far, and then And then the cripple comes on. Do you need it anymore, Jana? Thank you. Yeah, well, you know, me, water and a stage and a computer. What are you thinking? Thank you very much. Thank you, Barbie. Thank you, BAK. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Jana, Laura. Lots of respect for everybody in the room. I'm very sorry, I'm going to read a boring paper. But what I suggest you do is think of it as a kind of story, like a bedtime story or a pre the next drink story, or whatever helps you keep going. And as Maria said, this is a paper called How to Organize Otherwise, and it's quite a pragmatic paper. So it's a story about a space that I've attempted to pick up, to set up in Newcastle, which is the city in the north of England that I now work in, called the Experimental Studio. So it's a kind of quite a pragmatic story about the mechanisms through which I did that, and it's intertwined with some questions that poke a little bit at this idea of otherwise. And the poking is done in absolute respect to Maria and instituting otherwise, which is a concept that I have lived with for a number of years and really thought through. And the poking is meant in a way, am I allowed to do that? Yeah. In a way to test its resilience, one of the words that Barbie used. Okay. And I've been taking notes throughout the day and trying to kind of wind them in. I'm highly conscious of the fact that I'm kind of the last one up here. And the word I've got in big and bold here to start off is the, capital T, budget, capital B. So I'll try and come back to that at the end. But in a way, all my thinking, and for those of you that have known me for a while and had to listen to me or read me for a while, will know that I'm constantly thinking through budget, through money. Okay, so imagine it is yesterday. I'm sitting in a rough and ready public project space that also doubles as my office in an old print works in Newcastle, thinking about BAK. The project space, which we call the Experimental Studio, is on the ground floor of a building that has a long and much-loved history in the region, so that's the northeast region, the region of Newcastle, Gateshead, Sunderland, Teesside and its surrounds. Sorry, I keep losing myself already, not going well. It has a long and much-loved history in the region as an artist-run studio facility that is now defunct. It is, and has for a number of decades, been owned by the City Council, Newcastle City Council, and is now managed by the Baltic Centre of Contemporary Art, half used by Northumbria University for studios for its MFA and practice-based postgraduate PhD research students, and half rented by the council to creative industries clients. So it's financialized in three ways. I have been in post as the Baltic Professor, that's my name, for 2 years, and it's taken me and some comrades that amount of time, 2 years, to access and equip the space. So in institutional terms, in terms of a kind of BAK, that's quite quick, 2 years, but in my imagination, that's terribly slow. And for any of you that have ever been into this small experimental studio, and I'm sorry I'm not showing you any images, you'll realize that it's not like this. It's pretty rough and ready. The complexity of this setting up, this equipping, has been made by a number of factors, including the increasing financialisation of higher education in the UK and elsewhere, and the unspoken rationale of the university's partnership with the Baltic, which was established 11 years ago, partly for reasons of branding and prestige, and partly for reasons of boosting recruitment, the interminable bureaucratic load of contemporary academia, the mistrust, misunderstanding, and suspicion between the institutions, Northumbria University and the Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art, and the sheer unwillingness on the part of many students and staff to embrace the idea of a space of experimentation that does not fit with standard patterns of education delivery, to which I will return in a bit. I am not interested in bolstering recruitment for an MFA programme that largely supports the fragile, egoic nurturing of studio-based practice premised on individuality and the lie of successful market share. In fact, I would go further than that. I would say I'm not only not interested in it, but I seek to destroy it. Nor am I interested in negotiating the anger of institutional art educators who seek to dumb down complex scenarios which are formulated explicitly to provide spaces of disagreement. In fact, I would go farther than that. I would say I seek to destroy those things. Now, thanks to pilching and stealing and persuasion, now the experimental studio has 60 chairs, 2 tables, 2 ceiling mounting projectors that sometimes play sound and sometimes don't, lighting and sound mixing desks, i.e. basic infrastructure. I'm looking at what I perceive as the technical team. No? Feel sorry for me, right? To book the space, it's complex. You email me. And if nothing else is already booked in, and as long as your expectations are not unrealistic, I say yes. If you want a budget, curatorial niceties, wraparounds, or attentive support, you won't find it in a practical sense, but you will find it in terms of intellectual, social, and political love. There are a few rules that you have to observe, rules that have been made up entirely by me. It's autocracy at work. Firstly, you can't charge for anything you do. It must all be free. The space is free to use, therefore everything you do must be free. Nobody can charge an entrance fee for anything. So that's the first rule. And the second rule, and there are only 2 rules, is that some part of what you do must be made public. You must be prepared for people, and people is usually me, the crew of the building, the students, people who have found something of interest via our woefully bad media presence. You must be prepared for those people to come in and ask questions. Okay, so those are the 2 rules. First, it must be free. Secondly, it must be public. As much as possible, we avoid closing the space for what is normally termed installation or private conversations, though occasionally, for pragmatic terms, we hold PhD exams in there that require an element of privacy. Although if I had it my way, well, no, I wouldn't actually, because I don't like that kind of Germanic Swedish model of kind of trial by jury that happens in PhD exams, so I'll park that comment. We try to document what we do, but the we here is basically me, Rob, and Alan, 2 former students, one of whom is now doing a PhD with me, and so if he wants a tutorial, he has to kind of help me clean the floor, and the other, who I am trying to pay adequately for the indisputable fact that he works more hours than I can pay for him, and is therefore in a process, it's a kind of strange dance of me trying to get him, me teaching him not to self-exploit, and me teaching myself that it's okay to, it's complicated. The budget for the whole thing for a year is £15,000. It is, in many ways, a space run on what I've called just now political love. And perhaps this is opaque, but sometimes, I mean, opaque to the people that use it, opaque to the people that email me. But sometimes I think people get it. And people often talk about how nice and free the atmosphere is, which I kind of accept as a kind of recognition of what I'm trying to do. And I find even people who carry with them a certain amount of cultural entitlement, who I invite into the place, soon relax into observational listening and debating mode without worrying that if they want a cup of tea, they have to go and buy it in the cafe next door. But this is not an institution that I would fully claim as otherwise, in the sense that it is proposed, in the sense that is proposed in the rhetoric and in the build-up, in the discussions that have happened across the day at this symposium, in which, to quote the framework that we were given when we were invited to participate and join in with this day, in which the practices of the art institution are the actualization of the collective alternative imaginings, and where, to quote, key to such imaginary are the constituencies the institution serves and the consequent recompositions of institutional practice, not only with regard to what Western modernity used to call audiences, but also all institutional processes. Now, it's not that, not because I don't want it to be that, but it's just too difficult to make it that. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Rather than being that, rather than being an otherwise space, studio, experiment, it is a wedge pushed into a crack between the regulations of competitive partnerships that survives for the moment on the basis of its seeming generosity. Generosity and heterodox care or love are all we can offer as recompositional devices, in BAK's terms. Soon, and I'm counting the days quite literally, soon the university will ask why we are not charging people to use the space, or why the Baltic, with its sponsored generosity from the university, is not giving me a budget, or perhaps even more insidiously, from my perspective, why the Baltic is not curating the space so that I can get on with doing the things I'm supposed to be doing, which is writing funding applications for academic funding, increasing MFA subscription, I've already told you why I'm not doing that, and writing books, after all, that's what I'm paid for. The experimental studio is thus a wedge that is both the profit and the loss of the situated economic and psychic privatisation of universities and arts institutions in the UK. A small wedge, but a wedge nevertheless. It cannot be otherwise, since it's culturally and financially wound up in the systematic normativity of its extractive cultural infrastructure. And when I use the term wedge, I'm suddenly reminded of Red Wedge, which really dates me. Mick Wilson, are you still here? You can remember Red Wedge. Anybody else remember Red Wedge? Right, so Red Wedge was a kind of popular cultural movement that started in the 1990s, made by artists, lots of musicians, more musicians and theatre makers than visual artists, has to be said, in support of the development of a Labour government. And boy, do I wish we had something like Red Wedge at the moment in the UK. Okay, so that was an aside. Okay, so I said I come back to this term, why I've called it the experimental studio, so now I'm going to unpick very quickly this idea of experimentality. So the title experimental studio, harks back to the type of space that was set up either within higher education institutions proximate to them, or by graduates and their peers in the 1960s and 70s in the UK. The Arts Lab movement is a particular example of this, alongside organisations like the London Musicians Co-op, the Film Co-op, Sankofa, as Barby has just described, the Black Audio Film Collective, so a whole bunch of experimental, newly configured relationships between artists and people that we might now call curators, but we wouldn't have done then, and other forms of political organiser. So it's partly named in honour of that type, and in honour and loss of that type of activity and organisation. The concept of experimentation has become rather unfashionable in the visual arts, but within other academic disciplines it has gained traction, especially within the actor network theory movement that came out of STS, social science, social technology studies, in the 1990s and early noughties, and the neo-pragmatist philosophers. It is worth remembering that all science is based on experimentation. Philosopher-sociologists like Bruno Latour and Isabelle Stenger inspire me to move across disciplines and attempt to create spaces that re-engage with the unaffected aspects of the experimental that seem to be ironed out of contemporary art through institutional devices of control. What people seem to fear most is the open-ended nature of an invitation to experiment, at low cost, as I've just said, and thus with relatively little initial infrastructural effect, a process which often opens up arguments and contradictions. To experiment is to admit to one's own contingency and need for others, rather than to propose a version of oneself as a practitioner who operates in a zone of siloed self-reflexivity. As we all know, and as I'm moving towards in terms of otherwise, I keep gesturing towards Maria when I use the term otherwise, which is not fair, words are so difficult in the cultural sphere. They get used up and spat out by us and those that might be, or we might wish to be, our parallel constituencies. Thus, with experiment, I seek to reclaim it, however, in the name of the ongoing, the unfinished, the trans, or more precisely, to quote my friend and long-term collaborator Jason Bowman, the pre-disciplinary. Experimentality is a state in which things and bodies come together to test out new assemblages and choreographies, to bring together materials from different places and time zones in a bid to answer urgent questions, whether they be political, environmental, scientific, social, bodily, etc. Embedded in experimentality is collective inventive practice, in the sense that often experiments produce outcomes that are the result of unexpected alliances, and it takes a certain kind of left field imagination to put those things initially together to cause the ruckus that emerges. But experimentality is purposefully not a realm dominated by artists, curators, or even thinking and practice produced through aesthetic regards, even though many of those people and materials can and may be involved, but they're not dominant. So in this context, what is otherwise? To be truly otherwise, I don't even know whether I can say to be truly otherwise. I don't mean that. To be otherwise, I don't know whether one can be truly anything. To be otherwise is to renounce and redistribute your power, whether it be spatial, fiscal, or reputational, or many other forms of power. But redistribution is also a currency in itself. Only those rich in the capital of care, those that can afford to be generous, can afford redistribution towards the otherwise. What I have termed, in relationship to the experimental studio, what I have termed our meagre means, our generosity and care or love, are also precisely the capitals that breed mistrust amidst those who we would wish to collaborate with. Our interest is prefigured by a cultural capital formed on the basis of privileges of power. Above all, the power of enunciation, the power to invite people to the table, to anoint that which is an experiment and that which is not. Our hard fought for gestures, as BAK knows, and the whole team of people that is underneath the term BAK, our hard fought for gestures also form the basis of a blood-sucking industry fixed on capturing the very basis of our political and affective refigurations. There now exists a bank of alternative approaches to organisation within what might be broadly considered the arts, some more politically astute than others, some based on local pragmatism, some ideologically utopian, some focused on particular tasks. For instance, reducing an ecological footprint, catering for a specific community. And we've heard many of these in conversation today and mentioned all the practitioners of those organisations or alternative formulations being discussed today. Others simply capitalising upon what more and more frequently emerges as a curatorial theme. A good example of this, for example, and forgive me for using mainly British examples here, is Tate Exchange, which is a programme that happens at Tate Modern every year. They're threatening to make it a year-round programme. At the moment, it's only kind of captured within the summer months. Tate Exchange gathers together all the excluded from its programme each year and offers them prime art real estate use in exchange for visibility and on the premise that those that are gathered in find their own funding for those activities. This bank is therefore both heterodox, involving many actors of different intellectual, cultural, political, disciplinary and aesthetic ambitions, and radically uneven. And of course, I'm using that term knowing the great man himself was speaking here yesterday. From exhibition titles to serious financial redistribution attempts. So this idea of thinking organisationally, thinking infrastructurally, has moved from something that outliers have done, and those of us who have been kind of very critical of things to being the subject and thematic of biannuals, of large-scale art exhibitions internationally. Being otherwise is thus, and here we need to be careful, or I need to be careful, is thus a strenuous proposition put into difficult negotiated action within a defined sphere. It is that, but it is also a badge of fashionable intent, the purpose of which is in most cases to produce cultural capital for its named authors. What is the real otherwise that recognises the financial, social and often physical precarity that it engenders through its transformative logic, and I think that's what has been described thus far here, and what is the fake otherwise, which is the thing I'm kind of warning against, precisely warning myself against, on the basis that everything we do gets captured and co-opted. What is the fake otherwise proposed by biannual envisioners, soft-talking dealers, and artists impassioned by temporary social realignments? In June this year, my colleagues and I organised a symposium called Reorganising Cultural Institutions at B39, which is this old print works in which the experimental studio is located. The aforementioned building where the ES is located, it says here. The main spaces used for the event were two large and rather beautiful galleries on the top floor of this building that used to be much prized when it was an artist-run space, although let's not get nostalgic about artist-run spaces. And we commissioned an artist called Emily Hesse to make a new set of films in the experimental studio on the ground floor. Following, and this commission followed Emily and my joint interest in the history of witchcraft in the UK. And Emily thus made a witches institution that one had to walk through in order to get to the symposium conference. So we thought of it as a type of homeopathic cure for the talk upstairs. In a way, Jana, that reminds me of the acupuncture, the urban acupuncture that comes from you. We invited lots of people who ran cultural institutions, both internationally and in the cities. Newcastle and Gateshead are separate cities, but they are one unitary urbanism, I believe, that's what they're called. To talk about what they did and why they did it. The 2 days were confrontational and emotional. I cried quite a lot. Lots of calling out took place. Calling out me as the organizer, some international guests for their perceived colonialism, calling out of the space for its white infrastructure, both literally and in a colonial sense, its embedded affective and administrative power in a colonial and affective sense, of the Baltic for being inaccessible to local people and for its top-down outreach endeavours, for the event's lack of safety felt by a substantial group of the invited speakers. We attempted to reorganise and respond as we went along, but were also mindful that many people had travelled a long way and invested heavily to listen, had invested financially to listen to some of the people that were invited to come. It was a chance for people to come, to hear people talking, and it doesn't happen often in Newcastle. I mean, people talk a lot in Newcastle, but it's rare that international guests make the effort, Laura Raicovich as an exception, to bother to come to Newcastle. It takes 3 hours to get there from London, and it's cold, and it's small, and it's not very glamorous. Although it has a great nightlife. If you want to have a good night out in Newcastle, then you have to learn not to wear many clothes when it's very, very cold. I have been attempting to analyse this situation since we did it, so from June till now. And this is a kind of, I'm coming round to, I'm wrapping this back into the idea of what otherwise is, precisely because the symposium was called Reorganising Cultural Institution, and much of the discussion also would have kind of, lots of the languages are languages that we've also shared today. So despite the fact that I seem to have spent my life organising public discursive events and being part of them, I would certainly not organise in such a way again, despite the demands for international visibility on the part of my co-appointers, Baltic and Northumbria University. In a way, that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to bring them international visibility by inviting you lot. But I would not make the space of discursivity safe either, in the sense that it was being used in current debates and was also being used within some of the critiques and arguments that took place over those 2 days, which is not to say that I would not exercise great care and love. As Angela Dimitrikaki and Harry Weeks, who are compadres also with BAK, describe in the introduction of their editorial for the May 2019 issue of Third Text, which is called Anti-Fascism/Art/Theory. They didn't want it to be called Anti-Fascism Art Theory. They wanted to demonstrate they were pushing those things together in an uncomfortable way. As they say, and this is a quote, "We see the new terminology of cancelling and calling out in circulation at present as ideological. That is, the language prioritises atomised effect at the expense of what is politically at stake in opposing what can amount to, but does not always, a reactionary leaning in. That such individualising or moralising terminology has become prevalent at a time of major ideological conflict, confusion and tension should not be missed." Newcastle Gateshead, as I've said, is part of the northeast region in the UK, and it is an area of the UK that I'm sure a number of you know has suffered excessively from divestment in industry and employment over the past 40 years, and as a population which forms its socius and its politics through the often combative and frightened mixture of working class anger and demand for recognition and histories of and demand for recognition and histories of settled immigration in which people whose grandfathers were invited to work in the coal and shipyards in the 1960s now find themselves the target of a strong Brexit voting community. So there's a very, very, very strong, dominant admixture of race politics and class politics that often oppose each other. Being and making otherwise in this situation is tough, but I would say being and making otherwise is tough de facto. It's tough on the bodies of those that it needs the support of, and it is tough on the bodies of those that seek to produce it. There is nothing romantic about otherwise, I think, as a number of people have said throughout this day, and not much that is glamorous. I'm reminded of the architectural and design practice Estudio Teddy Cruz, who, working between San Diego and Tijuana, spends much of its time and energy slowly working in neighborhoods to change planning legislation to allow for migrant building to be recognized as legal property. Sure, Cruz occasionally becomes hot property on the art circuit, and I myself could be faulted for having made him so on occasions. But this work is long-term, collective, cooperative, unglamorous, and its ambition is specifically and politically aimed at a pragmatic core of change. In the same editorial of Third Text, and I'm coming to the final section of this paper, Dimitri Karki and Weeks name what they call conservative prefigurative politics that has come to dominate the political infrastructure of neoliberalism as it grows weak in the face of growing fascism in Europe and the USA, thus instituting new forms of fear. Here they draw upon Tony Negri. The urgency of instituting otherwise is not simply social and political, it must also be preventative of its tactics being taken up as precisely this form of conservative prefiguration. Why do I understand neoliberal arts institutions, and I don't understand BAK as a neoliberal arts institution, let me make that very clear, but why do I understand neoliberal arts institutions with their increasing desire to open out towards what we might understand as the otherwise, in more or less successful mimetic forms, as part of a conservative rather than a leftist prefigurative politics? As Dimitri Karki and Weeks point out, the term prefigurative politics is normally associated with the coming into being of a agentic acting that enables heterodox subjective positions to emerge and be held. Once they're held, of course, they are no longer prefigurative, but it's the process that is the prefiguration. But in their interesting refraction, to understand the idea of prefiguration, this space of coming into being, this space of otherwising, if we can make it into a verb, but in their interesting interaction, to understand this idea of prefiguration as a model taken up by the near and the far left, right, by the near and far right, is to really understand the mess that we are in. The question it is inevitable that I should ask, given my background, what I write and speak about, what I teach, etc., is how do cultural or arts institutions support the conservative prefigurative? And then, how can the otherwise be configured so that it overtakes this historically entrenched paradigm? The answer, which has many strata to uncover, and certainly because I'm absolutely with BAK and with Barbie and with a number of other people who have used the term today, I'm with the sense that this is all a rehearsal, so I'm not at the end yet. The answer, which has many strata, must somehow be to do with the assumptions of freedom and democracy that are naturalized within the infrastructures that support the artistic regime, its actors, its agents, its attendants, and its prefigurations. Others have made clear just how deeply contemporary art is embedded in this naturalization, even perhaps especially art that proposes to be the opposite. How deep shall we go? How deep is your love? And what are the implications that we will find? My mining metaphors here strike me for many reasons, two of which are these. One, because I've always been warned against mining metaphors on the basis of their patriarchal establishment and because I'm the child of postmodernism. And secondly, because I now work in an area of the UK that has basically was once made rich on the back of mining and is now destroyed by Margaret Thatcher's destruction of the mining industry and its unionisation in the 1980s. That was a bit of an aside as well. And that populace is now voting Brexit in large proportion on the basis of an ideological supremacy that ignores the fascist destruction of working people's livelihoods through capitalised new industries elsewhere in favour of pseudo-factoids about immigrants taking up all the hospital beds in the NHS. So this has been a story about a poor city in the UK, the idea of the otherwise, and whether I can bring those things together, and how my attempts to do so have seemed at best minimal and at worst co-optable in the extreme. Although it's been about a poor city in the UK, incidentally a poor city that has risen miraculously like a phoenix from the ashes on the basis of cultural gentrification, although nobody's told the poor people in the city that that's happened yet. But I hope the ramifications move beyond the UK and have some hold in wherever you're working, whatever you're trying to do. So finally, I'm going to end with a quote and say this, that I am with Wendy Brown when she talks about tolerance. And I want to read this last quote as a warning against the mistranslation of the complexities of instituting otherwise that are being proposed, against it turning into a form of prefigurative, conservative toleration. And this is what Wendy Brown says. Tolerance is generally conferred by those who do not require it on those who do. It arises within and codifies a normative order in which those who deviate from, rather than conform to the norms, are eligible for tolerance. The heterosexual proffers tolerance to the homosexual. The Christian tolerates the Muslim or the Jew. The dominant race tolerates the minority races, etc. Each of these only up to a point. However, the matter is rarely phrased this way. Rather, power discursively disappears when a hegemonic population tolerates a marked or minoritarized one. The scene materializes instead as one in which the universal tolerates the particular in its particularity, and in which the putative universal therefore always appears superior to the unassimilated particular, a superiority itself premised on the non-reciprocity of tolerance. The particular does not tolerate, or one could add, not have to tolerate, the universal. Let's guard the otherwise against conservative prefiguration. Let's make sure we retain it as a guise for, or not as a guise, as a structure of socialism, and let's make sure it does not operate within the bounds of toleration. Let's keep it ours on the left. Thank you.
we do a little check-in whether people still have energy for some questions?
She's still putting her arm around me. It's all right.
How do we feel about this?
I bet you're all exhausted, aren't you?
There are so many things to unpack. Shall we vote? No, we don't need. Yeah, vote. Can you? Yeah. You might stay a little. Well, yeah.
This is Maria's house. One of the things I kept thinking about as you were going, as you were going through was this public-facing attitude, and part of the reason that things like outreach and all that end up becoming part of the neoliberal technique or technology is because they only seek to serve the institution on one level under the guise of educating or transferring some type of knowledge from the institution's expertise to the public, right? And I think that there's a fundamental problem there in that most people have far more to contribute to the institution than the institution can give to them. And so within that, an entire reconfiguration has to be had around what the expectations are of both the institution from its interactions with the public and what the public feels that it might be able to contribute or gain from the institution itself. I don't know if you thought about that at all in your...
Yeah. I have. Oh, it's on. In the past, I've argued very strongly in writing and in talking against the idea, even of the idea of the public, because I think it creates because the concept, partly because it's a Eurocentric concept, partly because it's a divisive figuration of and spatialization of bodies, so that's one thought to put into that. But the second thing is, of course, yes, I completely agree with you, and I think many people said this earlier on as well, that it's often the sense that the constituencies that are brought into the institution, invited in or shimmied in or whatever way in which they're allowed in or invited, there's different kind of modalities of invitation, those people usually have, undoubtedly have much more to offer. And undoubtedly, I think people put this very, very well on the last panel discussion today. I think it was Matthijs who said it, that, is that Matthijs, if I said it right? Matthijs, I can't pronounce your name properly, sorry. Said it very, very well, that actually it's really clear that people have far more to teach me than I have to teach them. However, and that somehow instituting needs to find a structural way in which to enable that to occur. And I think that's what BAK has been doing. That's what the trainings are attempting to do. It's also, but it also takes time. How long have you been doing the trainings?
Since September 2020.
Yeah. So probably if you carry on doing it for 10 years, then, yeah? I'm up for that. No, but you know what I mean? It's actually about habit forming. So it's reversing the flow, in a sense. It's reversing the flow of power, yeah? And that's what you're doing. And you're trying to do. You're at the it's not like you're at the beginning of doing it. BAK's been trying to do this since it was conceived. As you said in your introductory speech today, it's a basis. It's not a centre. So therefore you up your Centre for Research Architecture. Centre for Plausible Studies, Centre, I'm just trying to think of all the centres I know. So I think that this reversal really needs to be taken seriously, but it won't be taken seriously while, the gatekeep, somebody else was talking about gatekeeping earlier on today, while the gatekeepers in the arts institutions, particularly within the education /learning /outreach /engagement areas are are making the invitation based on this concept of toleration, or what I'm now calling, following Dimitri Kaki and Wheat's, conservative prefiguration. And in conservative prefiguration, just to be absolutely clear, or from my understanding of it, as they use it, the mechanism or the structure of the invitation becomes one that is bound up with Wendy Brown's idea of tolerance. So you get invited in to become a node of prefiguration in order to allow the institution to capture your prefigurativeness and therefore enable it to grow its cultural capital upon that. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say there is that in that rather complex way, is that cultural institutions and their governance, both consciously and unconsciously, are super smart, yeah? And that they're, it's like, one thinks Boris Johnson is a complete fucking idiot, but actually he's probably 3 steps ahead of us. And I think that's the situation we're in when we're talking about. So Tate Exchange, for example, this programming line that I mentioned, Tate Exchange is based on that idea of prefiguration, conservative prefiguration. Yeah, if you invite. Okay, let's make it clear, because Barbie, you and I have done something for Tate Exchange, yeah? Okay, so we invite us in and we do our shit in Tate Exchange, then they can say that they've invited us in, and therefore it gives them a huge amount, of brownie points.
I was just telling Jeanne how actually I had been asked to do something else at Tate Exchange, and that the director, or whoever is kind of running it, had heard that I'd been critical.
She calls herself a placemaker.
Okay, placemaker. Had heard that I'd been critical, and said that I needed to come in and clear the air. For which, I told her, which was basically to fuck off. Because this is a kind of particular kind of problematic, but I want to follow up on what you said, actually, because I actually also think there's a particular, it kind of, this work, this kind of outreach that you get produces, or the people that do it produce a particular kind of culture, but actually, I also think that this kind of charitable culture is, has, as James Baldwin might describe it, as missionary, and actually kind of in some ways might have described itself once as a form of like what would you call it, like a kind of religious socialism, and it kind of perpetuates particular kinds of I'd say kind of aggressions and violences, actually. And sometimes as an artist that puts kind of can navigate institutions, but actually puts a proposal forward, there's a lot of how can I explain it? I think tragedy in the fact of not being able to control that from that position, from my experience, and that actually, like this placemaker, would rather have me perform some kind of kowtowing to them, which just is like, to me, is like another form of kind of abuse, extraction, ethnographic kind of performance. Yes.
Barbie, I completely agree, and I mean, we this is a particular observation and experience you and I have shared, but I'm sure there are people have similar experiences in different institutions, not just in the UK, although I think it's particularly pernicious in the UK and the USA. But I just wanted to say that this idea of unpicking what otherwise might be, for me, was an exercise in trying trying to test it as much as possible, in a sense, to try and test its strength, to try and push at it to make sure that we can go with it as a term, but not to go with it as a term as well, in order to evade capture, in a sense, because I think it's a technique. Yeah, I think that's maybe what we can. If we understand otherwise as a technique, then that might be a methodology. That might be a useful way of thinking about it, and that's why experimentation is also interesting to me. I also understand that experimenting has lots of issues.
We have a few questions here, but I wanna look at this otherwise, whether it can be used as part of this prefigurative conservative politics. Thinking a little bit of Bonaventura de Sousa Santos, who himself claims, "Watch out, we on the left," whatever that means today, have lost the radical nouns, right? That with kind of enough firmness can articulate certain ideas such as whatever, revolution, democracy, because they have been co-opted by prefigurative conservative politics. Now, I have assumed that that conservative prefiguration operates on dichotomies of the self and the other, and that otherwise is built to circumvent the dichotomies in a way. This is what I tried to introduce in the beginning. So you really got me thinking, because this is, of course, a very critical and dangerous moment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that I hope we're thinking in the same brain or whatever, because my explicit, no, I don't know if it's explicit, my real fear is that prefiguration is not based on dichotomy, and then it becomes much, much, much more problematic. It becomes much more difficult to summarize, to understand, to avoid, to evade, because because one can't see it as an either-or. One can't see it working in that way, and I think that's the issue. It's also, I think there's a real problem with the way in which, as cultural organizers and workers, we're so good at picking things up and turning them into practice and turning them into things, and then getting hoisted by our own petard because we've done the job so well.
I had a question about maybe making new relations and maybe working within the infrastructure of an institution to change it, to maybe care for their clients or the people that are being brought in, like we were saying, they kind of, as a student or someone who's, being brought into an art institution and then giving this, your talent or your creativity being manipulated and used. Is there like an actual way to put pressure on the institution to care for their clients? Is there like a legal way to kind of put that in their face? Like the way that they're actually abusing the people that they're, or maybe it's a very strong term, abuse, but...
It's probably quite accurate in lots of cases. I mean, I can't, I mean, I think that depending on, I mean, in terms of legality, it depends in which jurisdiction you're in. There will be different legal... Yeah, I mean, legally in the UK, for instance, a university has to take care of its students. It is legally bound to take care of them. And there's been lots and lots and lots of issues over the past 10 years, but of course they've only risen to the surface over the past 10 years. They've been there forever, about questions of mental health and pressure and lack of care in a medical and psychological sense with students. And so there have been lots of test cases around this. And in fact, there's over the last 5 months, there's been a very effective sit-in at Goldsmiths University where Black, Asian, minority, ethnic students have occupied the town hall, which is a large part of the Goldsmiths campus, in order to protest lack of care. And it's succeeded in making changes through its protest to the legal frameworks of the institution itself. However, that's one part of your question. Another question is how, I think the infrastructure of arts education, which is what I'm talking about, is premised on forms of abuse that are to do with hierarchies of success, domination of particular forms, marketization of gesture. So I think there's also a more pernicious thing here, which means that, and I'm sure this also happens in other in other disciplines as well. I'm absolutely sure it does, but I'm only speaking from what I know and what I'm involved in, that this is why I'm very angry with the MFAs. I really do think we should close all Masters of Fine Art programs down everywhere, because they're based on a lie, and the lie is that if you do this, particularly now they're financialized, if you do this course, then you will have the possibility of becoming the 0.0001% person who gets a gallerist and gets shown at Frieze Art Fair. You know, it's cruel. It's cruelty. Yeah. Well, I at the moment I'm trying to set up a course that replaces the MFA called Critical Production, which recognises the intelligence of all people, the intelligence of all people that are involved in the production of cultural activity, so that if you go on this program, go on my program, then you will learn to clean the floor, learn to wire the sound system, learn to stretch a canvas if you so wish, and learn to support other people as well. And so there's that. But that is really modelled on histories of community education that are very strong, that were very strong in the UK, often came out of unionism or self-organisation, the settlement movement. And I know that there are quite European versions of that as well. And so I would return to those. In fact, Northumbria University, before it was Northumbria University, was Newcastle Polytechnic. And I think the idea of polytechnic education is something that is sorely missed in the UK. And polytechnic education isn't based on individuality and self-reflexivity. It's based on collective learning and problem solving. And the community arts education movement and the community arts movement are incredibly important in that. So those are the models I'd return to. And so if we return to those models, yes, we could reverse something. But there ain't much money in it. That's the problem.
No, it's late. Yeah. I like that kind of notion of destruction you presented a couple of times, and I connected it to the abstract, where you seriously question whether institutions can be reformed. So I wonder whether there was some kind of subtle destruction proposition based on there. Yeah. But then political love, so not politics of love, but political love, yeah, that you mentioned a couple of times. I'm also wary of the concept. Basing politics on love is making oneself vulnerable, probably.
I think there's a difference between basing politics on love and political love.
Tell me what political
I
love
don't
is.
know.
I'm
I knew
ready
you'd
to
go
learn.
off that. Well, to be honest, I was using the term care, but I'm so concerned about the use care that I attempted experiment exactly, and I was experimenting with the idea of love. There's lots of very interesting theoretical work on love that I've been very influenced by, coming out of queer writing and Black futurism, where there are some different models of love that I think could be taken up, but they're very utopian and they're often fictional. But hey, there's no problem with taking a fiction and making it into something that is livable, to use the terms that have been used a lot today. So I think political love is to do with solidarity and commitment, and political love is not individualized. Political love is something that is a shared concern. So one of the people that I've been finding out a lot about recently, because I'm doing a big project on with a friend and a comrade at Northumbria University called Julie Crawshaw, on the feminist activist Jane Addams, who set up the Hull House settlement in Chicago. You know about this, and is often overshadowed by John Dewey, the pragmatist philosopher, who I'm also very respectful of. But Jane Addams was actually doing the pragmatics, and he was writing about it. And she worked with a brilliant woman called Florence Kelly, who described herself in 1898 as a feminist, a socialist, a social feminist pragmatist. And I thought, that's about love. So it's that's kind of, I think that's there. It's kind of what I think
this is wonderful to end up with.
Yeah.
What was it? Social, feminist, pragmatist? I'm all for it. Did I get it wrong?
I can't remember. I might be getting it wrong. I will find the term and report back.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you. I applaud all of you, all of us. Thank you for being here and speaking with us.